Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear further evidence from Mr. Kevin Lamb. So would you ask Mr. Lamb to come into the room, please? Good morning, Mr. Lamb.
Good morning.
Are you ready to carry on?
Certainly am, yes.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Miss Grange.
Thank you. Yes, good morning, Mr. Lamb.
Hi there.
So when we broke yesterday, I had been asking you some questions about a run of documents to do with a window approval process, window detailing.
Yes.
And if you recall, it was a process where ultimately Simon Lawrence kept getting looped back in and asked for his approval.
That's right.
And you were right in the middle of explaining to us that that was not necessarily a representative example of the way it normally worked. That was an exceptional case.
Exactly, yes.
Because it was a late addition and it had caused potential, or might have caused, cost consequences for riding. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Is there anything more you want to say on that? Because what I was going to do next is try and take you to perhaps something that looks more like a normal example of what happened on the project.
No, I don't need to add to that,
Yeah.
I don't think.
Okay. Well, let's look at another example. Let's turn up SEA 3013221. This is an email dated it. Yes, if we look at the one at the bottom of the first page, 29th of May 2015, and you address it to Simon Lawrence, but address your email to Neil Crawford. You've copied in others as well, including Daniel Anketel-Jones. And you say, Neil, please find attached drawings for the crown element for approval. Yes?
Yes, that's right.
And then we can see in the top that on the 12th of June, Neil Crawford comes back to you, copying in the same individuals. Hi, Kevin, please find attached comments on the crown drawings. So he's now commented. And if we can turn to the attachment to that email, this is RYD 43547, and I want to look at page 4. So I think what we're looking at here, correct me if I'm wrong, is some detailing at the very top of the building. Is that
That's right, just under the crown, yes.
Just under the crown. And we can see that it had the issued for approval stamp on there. That's the other stamp that we mentioned yesterday.
That's correct, yes.
And I can now
normal.
take you to this example of it.
That's normal, yes.
So that would normally come first from you.
Yes.
When it was going over to the architect.
Yes. Yeah.
And then later you would get the approved for construction stamp. That was your practice.
That's it. Following a response from the architect where it's either B or an A and there's clear comments.
Now, I think this drawing is a Rev 0 to a Rev 0. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Can you help us as to what that means or what that meant?
That means that's the very first issue of that drawing.
Yeah. So you haven't had any previous version of it yourself or through Studio E?
No.
And that was entirely your drawing, was it?
It's based on Neil Crawford's designs, yes.
Yeah, I see. And we can see that Neil Crawford has stamped the drawing with a B.
Yes.
Conforms to design intent subject to incorporation of comments, revise and resubmit for category A status.
Correct.
And we can see his comments in red and the bubbles.
Yeah.
He wants the existing roof parapet requires to be surveyed and metal coping flashing to fit over.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Now, just taking this drawing through its story, if we now turn to SEA 3013262, we can see from the bottom email on the 1st of July, you send to Simon Lawrence, you say an email copying in Neil. I think we'll see in a moment, you see up the page that you copy in the wrong Neil to start with,
Yes.
and then you copy in the right Neil. But I think you're addressing this to Neil Crawford, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And you say, Neil, please find attached revised coping detail to the crown element. If you could have a quick look and pass your comments, we shall then reissue the whole of this element for construction based upon your previous approvals. Having shorter coping will allow it to run between columns, being far more tidy, etc. So that was your email to him, and then it is eventually copied. If we scroll up the screen, it goes to the right Neil Crawford.
Yeah,
And then we see that Mr. Crawford responds at 19:03 on the same day, later that same day, and he attaches another drawing. If we can turn to that, this is SEA 13263. And here we've got the window head coping. Is that right?
that's correct. Yeah, it's the same drawing again.
Yes.
Being revised, yeah.
And we've now got status A, conforms to design intent. And we've still got the issued for approval stamp at this stage.
Yeah.
Now then, if we carry on with the story of this drawing, if we now turn to HAR 404443, so 4443, on the 26th of August 2015, 1733, you send an email, Neil, main entrance adjusted as your further comments this morning. Don't worry about that, because that's about the main entrance, but then you say cladding drawing just with additional set out info for the installers.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah, I do.
And we think it's that comment that is relevant to this drawing.
Okay.
And it would appear that yes, so then we get Neil Crawford on the 28th of August responding saying, hi Kevin, no further comments as attached. And if we can look at the attachment, this is SEA 403310, and we need to look at page 3. And we can now see that this has got to revision B of this drawing.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
that's correct, yeah.
We see that from the little box at the bottom on the left.
Yes, yeah.
And we've got conforms to design intent on that revision B of the drawing.
Yeah.
So he's happy with it.
Yes, yes.
And it's marked status A. And it would appear to us that it was that drawing that was then issued for construction.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So is that example more representative of the approval process that you were going through on the project to get
Definitely.
from the drawings that Studio E had sent or the Harley discussions you'd had at the beginning through the design process through to something being issued for construction?
Totally.
Yeah, thank you, that's helpful. Who, in your view, had ultimate responsibility for checking and approving the drawings you were producing? Who did the buck stop with?
The architect.
Right, yeah. And that would be consistent with what we've just looked at and your understanding of the process?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Can we now turn to look at another example? This is HAR 404590. This is an email from you to Simon Lawrence on the 20th of October 2015. And you've copied in a number of other individuals there, including Daniel Anketil-Jones, Mark Stapley, Ben Bailey. And you write, Neil, please find attached GF curtain wall elements for comment approval. Can you help us as to what the GF means?
Ground floor.
Ground floor. Okay. Now, one of those drawings, it's in the second line of the attachments in the middle, is C1059 GA model 50223.
Okay.
You see that there?
Yeah.
And if we turn to that drawing, this is at SEA 403316. We can see that this does not have any red Studio E stamp, as Mr. Crawford appears not yet to have reviewed it. However, in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see approved for construction.
That's correct, yes.
Do you know, can you help us as to why this drawing was marked approved for construction before Studio E or Ryden had looked at it?
That was simply a clerical error.
A clerical error?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, what we tend to do is we'll, when we're producing drawings, we'll copy a drawing border to a clean space on the drawing model, put the drawing in the drawing border, and in this particular instance, I must have copied
Yeah.
the incorrect stamp.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would have caused any confusion with anyone.
And so should the stamp that should have been on here been the issued for approval with the dotted line on it?
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Crawford then replies, just keep following this story through, he replies to the email you sent. If we turn to HAR 404669, we see him coming back to you on the 22nd of October. Hi, Kevin, please see attached comments on ground floor. And he's attached some drawings, and one of them is the one we were looking at, drawing 223. If we go to HAR 404670 at page 3, is that the same drawing?
It is, yeah.
And we can see here that Mr. Crawford has made a number of comments and suggestions on the drawing, and he's marked it status B. Yes?
Yes, yeah.
You then respond to Mr. Crawford's email. This is HAR 404743. You respond on the 26th of November 2015. And you say to him, Neil, please find attached GF curtain wall, so ground floor curtain wall drawings revised in accordance with your comments. And you've given a number of notes.
Yeah.
Including relating to 223, which would have been covered in the 222 to 228. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
And if we look in the, yes, and then in the attachments, we can also find that drawing, and it's now 223A. It's the second line from the bottom on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
We see the 223A.
Yeah.
So that's revision A of drawing 223.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if we turn to HAR 401999, this appears to be an email of the same date as the one we just looked at, 26th of November, from Ben Bailey to someone called Mike and Lucy at AJF, Aluminium and Glass Facades Limited. Is that right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I'm aware of them. Yeah.
I think they're a fabricator. Is
They
that
are,
correct? And Ben Bailey is writing on the same day, and it's the same set of drawings. Please see our construction issue drawings attached for Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
You see that?
Yes, yeah.
And the second email down in this chain is the email from you returning the revised drawings to Mr. Crawford with his comments on.
Yeah.
But we'd seen no receipt from Mr. Crawford of an email confirming the revisions were acceptable and stamping the drawings status A, had we?
No, but he had stamped them status B.
Yeah. And does this go to the point we were discussing yesterday, that in practice it was common to take status B as, well, provided you incorporate those comments, this is approved?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And by the virtue of the email that returned those drawings, we were quite clear in which of his comments we couldn't fulfil.
Right.
There was a list of areas.
So when you went back with your comments,
Yeah.
I see. But that dialogue hasn't necessarily ended, has it?
I don't recall, but...
I mean, would you agree that it would be best practice to wait for Mr. Crawford to return, having marked the drawings as status A?
I think Ben was being proactive. I think at this stage he was getting prices from AGF.
Yeah.
So I'm sure he would have checked that we were all fully up to construction before placing the order.
Yeah. So just to be clear on your evidence, is it your evidence that it was most common on this project to proceed to make the changes indicated by stamp B and not to send a document back for status A?
I was always sent back,
Yeah,
but we would actually start working
once
on
you've got the status B.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Now, just on a topic of revisions after approval on drawings, again, I think you touched on this yesterday, and you said
Yes.
that on occasion, I think you said it happened on the Grenfell project.
That's correct, yes.
That there would be further comments from the architect after you'd got what you felt was approval from them.
That's correct, yeah.
And if we look at paragraph 30 of your witness statement, HAR 3010419, at page 7, I think you've explained that to us. And this is where, about 5 lines down, you've also explained the point about if a drawing was marked as status B, that meant that fabrication could proceed, taking into account the revision.
That's correct, yeah.
So you explained that to us in your witness statement.
Yeah.
And I want to pick it up towards the end of that paragraph, 2 lines up from the bottom there. You say, once drawings were approved for construction, I would then produce fabrication drawings for the specific components. There were, however, times, if we can go over the page, when a drawing had been approved for construction and the architects or Ryden changed their mind about an aspect of the external facade, such as the window configuration, and you give an example, and there would be further revisions to the drawings.
Yes.
How common was that on the Grenfell project?
I think it was very rare.
Rare. So it wasn't something that was a problem?
No, often it incurred costs and program implications, so the teams would ensure that this sort of thing wouldn't be, it would only be an essential change.
Were there any other occasions when the process of checking and revision that you've outlined for us was not strictly followed?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah. Now, in paragraph 31, in the next paragraph, if we just read the first 4 lines, you say, as can be seen from the drawings themselves, revisions to drawings were marked up with a letter dated and described as they were made. These revisions generally reflected comments from the architects. However, there were revisions made later on in the process that were not submitted to the architects or Ryden for their comment. And you go on to give an example of that. And you talk about revision D of drawing C1059302. And you say it was a little bit further, it was in the context of drawing up the fabrication drawings for the cladding panels. And it looked to you like the drawing could be improved aesthetically. And you discussed this with Ray Bailey, and it was decided to remove the return on the cladding facing the window and include an aluminium angle instead. Is that the aluminium angle that Mr. Bailey explained to us in his evidence? No, it's different, is it?
No, it's not, it was an aesthetic trim from memory.
Can you just help us as to what the...
I think... Right, I think it was to do with tolerancing of the panels. The cladding panels returned to the window.
Yeah.
And you need a nice clean edge. Now, if there's a slight out of tolerance of the building, which throws the windows slightly out of alignment, then you could get gaps.
Yeah.
And I believe these were sort of closure angles that were screwed to the window first, so that any minor discrepancy would be totally hidden.
I see.
Purely an aesthetic issue.
Yeah. So that's you've given that as and is that a representative example, would you say, of the type of change that was made, which wasn't run past the architect? That
wasn't normal, and I think at this stage, because we were actually manufacturing panels, to stop manufacture, to run it past the architect, I think Ray certainly felt it was worth the risk that the architect wouldn't be happy, but I don't see how he could be unhappy with it because it was only improving the aesthetic quality of that joint. So.
Can you help us as to whether any other category of drawings were not submitted to the architect for approval?
Fabrication drawings weren't issued to him, only the GA drawings.
Yeah. And is that in common with normal industry practice?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any concerns about drawings not being issued to the architects for approval on this project?
No,
No.
not at all.
I now want to turn to a different topic, which is about the ACM Rainabond cladding.
Okay.
We've touched on that a little bit when we talked about the guidance in this area in ADB, but I want to just return to this. If we pick this up in your witness statement at paragraph 20, this is HAR 30100419 at page 5. And we look in the 6th line down, it begins on the right-hand side. Actually, it's the 5th line down, sorry. You say, it had been decided prior to my involvement in the project that the cladding was going to be cassette and that ACM was the material to be used.
That's correct.
You see that there?
Yeah.
Now, when you sit down to develop a design, do you agree you must first understand the design to date and the materials which are going to be used?
Just bear in mind that my client was Harley, so I'm working under their instructions.
Yeah.
So where there's departures from the architect's concept, they're the ones telling me, right, we're not doing... In this instance, I think the architect's drawings originally showed face-fixed cladding panels, and Harley said to me, no, I want you to draw cassette panels because it's been agreed over the previous period whilst working up the quotations.
Yeah. Were you familiar with the Rainabond ACM product?
I was reasonably familiar with the product in general, not necessarily Rainabond. I'd used a Lucabond before.
Yeah.
But it's a very generic product.
Were you aware at the time that the product was formed of 2 thin sheets of aluminium with a low-density polyethylene PE core?
No, I understood that it had a core and it was faced with aluminium skins, but I wasn't aware of the actual properties of the core.
And you never asked anybody on the project, just so I know what is in the core? You didn't ask that?
No, all I knew was it was to provide a lightweight composite panel. I had no reason to question it.
Did you have any idea what type of material might be in the core? For example, that it was a thermoplastic. Would you have known that much?
No, I mean, I assumed it was a plastic.
You did make that assumption?
Yeah, plastic or a resin type material, but I didn't think any further than that.
Okay. Was it any part of your role to consider whether the ACM was appropriate, bearing in mind the building regulations and the associated guidance in ADB?
No, not at all. But if I was concerned, I would have raised an issue.
Now, if we turn up the Harley specification, this is RYD 30468822. These are the Harley specification notes.
Yeah.
And we see at the bottom that revision A came on the 3rd of March 15 and it was revised a number of times. Mm-hmm. And we'll look at this again and again in your evidence because we'll come to look at some of the other products that are on here. But just panning out again, looking at the whole document, was this document prepared by you?
Yes.
And can you just help us as to how you went about preparing these specification notes?
Well, these are all the materials that I was instructed to use. from the Harley team.
So was there any sense in which you yourself looked at the NBS specification and then transposed that into this? Or
No.
is this solely the product of discussions you'd had with Harley?
No, if there was doubt from Harley, they might say, well, check the NBS. I don't recall them doing that in this case. I was told which materials would be used.
And would you be told verbally or would you be given a written instruction?
No, verbally across the table at our design meetings. Our very first design meeting
Yeah.
covered most of this.
So you'd take notes of what you were being told
Yeah,
and then you'd put it into this, yeah?
that's right, yeah.
And who at Harley would you expect to check this?
Dan and or Ray, maybe Mark Stapley.
And what would you expect they would be checking for?
That I've put their instructions down on the drawing correctly.
And checking that those materials were appropriate to use given the requirements of, for example, the building regulations?
I'd been given the materials, so I presume that was a process that they'd done prior to that point.
Yeah.
So at the point where they're checking my drawings, they're checking it against their instructions that they've given to me. They're not re-going over the conformance.
But just to be clear, it was your assumption, was it, at the time that there would have been a process for selecting these materials within Harley and checking that they were compliant with relevant requirements?
I don't know that it would necessarily have come from Harley, because there had been, I don't know, certainly at least a year before I came on the scene, they'd had many discussions with the client, the architect, and whoever else. I mean, I don't know exactly. So I can only assume that in those discussions, someone has considered the conformance.
Right. Suppose the NBS specification was silent about particular material to be used in a particular location, or perhaps only specified a performance specification and left the precise selection of that product to Harley. Would you expect in those circumstances that somebody within Harley would have checked before telling you what the product was, that it was compliant with relevant requirements?
Yes, I guess so, yes.
Now, we can see also that this was issued, this specification, this set of specification notes was issued to Studio E architects.
Yeah.
And they've marked it, Mr. Crawford has marked it, conforms to design intent there,
Yeah.
status A.
Yeah.
And just to be absolutely clear, would you understand that meant that Mr. Crawford was satisfied that these products were appropriate to use on the building, given the statutory requirements, including the building regulations?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, we're going to come back and look at this in relation to some of the other specific materials. But for now, on the ACM panels, we can note right at the very top left that we see system, metal technology, high thermally broken aluminium windows, and then the Rainabond composite rain screen cassettes.
Correct, yeah.
You see that there. So this specification does record the type of ACM that's to be used.
That's correct, yeah.
Now, when you put this specification together and you put the Rainabond in there, did you look at the BBA certificate for the Rainabond panels? Was that any part of your role?
No, not at all, no.
Were you aware that there was a BBA certificate for the Rainabond panels?
It never crossed my mind, but a product of this prominence, you would imagine there would be one.
Yes. Had you ever seen a BBA certificate for those panels before on other jobs?
No.
Can we just pull it up? This is at BBA 6047. So it's dated, it's from 2008. It's number 084510. And then, sorry, if we can just pan out, we actually see the date on the bottom of this first page, date of first issue, 14th of January 2008. Can you see that there in the blue box, the pale blue box?
Yeah, I get that.
So this certificate predated the Grenfell project by some years.
Yeah.
Were you familiar with BBA certificates generally? Had you ever come across them in your design work before?
I knew they existed,
Yeah.
but as a subcontract draftsman, it was never really my role
Yeah.
to consider the
Yeah.
contents to any degree. No.
So just to be clear, it was not part of your role to look at that certificate, check anything in it about the product before you put it on the specification notes?
No, not at all. No.
Would you have expected somebody within Harley to have done that? So before they told you across the table the cassette panels are going to be Rainabond, would you have expected somebody within Harley to have looked at this BBA certificate and have understood the information it was conveying?
I would expect a member of the team or members of the team would have considered this when they were working up the materials. Now,
Yeah.
I certainly at the time, I was not aware of who decided what materials were to be used. Harleys were telling me what they wanted to be used. Maybe they'd been told by the architect, maybe they'd been told by the builder. I don't know that.
Yeah. If we look on within section 6 of this certificate, under section 6, which is about fire performance. Sorry, it's on page 5. Apologies. So there's a whole section on behaviour in relation to fire, and I appreciate your evidence that you say it wasn't part of your role to look at this.
Yeah.
But what becomes apparent when you do read this is that there was something called a standard sample of the product, which we now know was the PE sample of the product.
Right.
And in 6.2, it then talks about a fire retardant sample of the product.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Were you aware in general terms when you were working on this project and putting together that spec, were you aware that there was a fire retardant version of these panels?
Not at all.
So that was not something you were ever told or not something discussed at the Harley meetings?
No, I have used Lucabond products in the past, and again, I never knew that they had different grades.
You just didn't know that?
No.
Let's just look at the initial order of the ACM. If we can turn to CEP 60512. This is an email. You're not a recipient or copied into this email, but what we see here is it's Mark Stapley on the 25th of February 2015 to Jeff Blades of CEP, copying in Ben Bailey, and it's about Grenfell Tower ACM panel requirements. And he says, "Hi Jeff, please find attached our cladding panel requirements for Grenfell Tower. Can you provide us with your most competitive price and also confirm lead times?"
Yeah, I see that.
You've seen that. And we know that the ACM panels had been formally signed off by planning in September 2014. Can you help us as to why Harley didn't begin obtaining quotes for the fabrication of the panels until late February 2015, almost 5 months later?
I would guess at this stage they needed more finite dimensions of the panels to get an accurate price.
I see. And so they had to wait for your work to reflect
That's correct,
that.
yes. Whether it was preliminary or I wouldn't have thought it was finalised at this stage, but we must have had a
Well, is that something you know about, or is that just your own sort of speculation?
Yeah, to be fair, it is speculation.
Okay.
It is normal.
Yeah, okay. Can we turn to the attachments that Mr. Stapley included with that email? This is ACM panel requirements, CEP 60513. So here we have the requirements that are being sent to CEP. And I think if we look in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see this is a drawing dated the 16th of February 15, and we've got your little lamb symbol and KVL.
Yeah.
Does that mean you drew this?
Certainly
You
did.
put this drawing together?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is your work. And then slightly to the left of that, we can see that the specification, sorry, if we can just pan out again. We see there in the middle at the bottom it says material Rainabond,
Yes,
and then the finish smoke silver metallic Duragloss
correct.
5000 satin. So that's the material you were told to put on there and you wanted to use, or
That's correct.
Harley wanted to use. And turning to page 4, there's a list of notional material requirements. Again, is that
Yeah.
something you would put together?
In this case, I did, yes.
Yes. So you put this list together.
Yes, I can't remember whether it was Mark Stapley, but I was asked to produce an approximate list of requirements.
Yes.
So materials could be pre-ordered, or maybe it was for costing purposes. Don't recall exactly.
Yes. And what we note that is in neither case, neither in the drawing nor here, does it mention what the core of the ACM would be. It just says Rainabond, and then we get the finish.
That's correct. As I understand it, Harley were in discussions with CEP.
Yeah.
And they all knew the material that was going to be used.
Would it be normal in your experience with these kind of details, fabrication details, not to specify the core to be used in an ACM panel on these kind of drawings or specifications?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, certainly from my point of view, I wasn't aware that there were different cores. No one raised that with me. And I would expect CEP, if there was any confusion, they would say, well, what core do you want on this?
Yes.
And they would be keen to provide this with the most expensive core, obviously.
You began that answer with no, not necessarily. My question was, would it be normal in your experience for these kind of details, including fabrication details, not to specify the core to be used in an ACM panel? Can I ask it this way? Have you been involved in other projects where the core has been specified?
No.
No.
No. I've done very little ACM, certainly as far as fabrication drawings are concerned, to this degree. But no, I've never specified the core.
But pulling it back from ACM, would you expect these kind of details to be very specific about the composition of, say, a composite product and exactly what was being requested?
Quite often there are elements missing on drawings which are discussed at the point of purchasing. Certainly with Harley, they were very close with CEP. And I was well aware that there'd been many discussions between the two parties way before I was employed. So I'd be very surprised if there was any confusion on that point. But,
Okay. Now, sticking with the ACM, can we now turn to another email? This is HAR 406585. And this is an email that Mr. Anquetil Jones sends to Ray Bailey. It's just the two of them on this email chain. So you're not a recipient and you're not copied in, just to be clear. It's on the 27th of March 2015. And they've been discussing the requirement for fire barriers or cavity barriers at the tower, and what the rating was, and whether it was a requirement for fire stopping or for cavity barriers.
yes.
You're nodding. Does that mean you're familiar
Yes.
with this line of emails?
No, I'm agreeing with what you're saying.
I see, yeah. And what I want to ask about is the second line in this. And Daniel Anquetil Jones said, there is no point in fire stopping. As we all know, the ACM will be gone rather quickly in a fire, ! You see that there?
I can see that, yes.
Now, did Mr. Anquetil Jones ever say anything similar to you about ACM, whether on the Grenfell project or on other projects?
No, not at all. No.
Had it been said to you, would you have agreed with what was said there? The ACM will be gone rather quickly in a fire.
Not if you read it as it's said literally. No, I wouldn't agree with that.
So how would you read it?
I mean, this is... should I be interpreting this?
I
It's a
take
very
your
good
point.
question.
I take your point.
I don't think Mr. Lamb's an expert on these.
I understand that. I just wanted to know if he'd ever had a conversation with anyone about the ACM and how it would perform in a fire during the project. And the
No,
answer, I think,
no.
is no. So I'll move on. I just want to ask now about informal meetings that you might have had with Studio E and RBKC Building Control.
Yeah.
So Mr. Crawford, when he gave evidence to the inquiry, stated that there were a number of informal workshops with RBKC Building Control where drawings were discussed. Now, did you ever meet any of the RBKC Building Control officers on the project? No.
Not at all, no.
So those can't have involved you?
No.
No, fine. And it would follow, therefore, that you couldn't have met Mr. John Hoban on the project or discussed with him
No,
The-
definitely not.
the materials for the project. So I now want to ask you about the insulation product that was used behind the spandrel and column rain screen panels at Grenfell. Now, we've already discussed the NBS specification. We know that the NBS specification featured a product called Celotex FR5000 as the insulation product.
Yeah.
Were you aware of that at the time of working on the Grenfell project, that the product in the NBS was FR5000?
I don't know whether I even saw that. I mean, I was told at a point later on in the project that we were using the RS. But I don't think it ever struck me that that was contrary to the FR.
Let's just look at that briefly in the NBS specification. If we go to SEA 50169 at page 73, and it's item 776. So again, this was part of the H92 section, the rain screen cladding section of the NBS spec.
Okay.
And we can see in the second bullet point down, the manufacturer was Celotex Limited, and a little bit further down is an indented dash, and it says product reference FR5000,
Yes.
aluminium foil face both sides.
Yeah.
Does that help as to whether or not you saw that at the time?
No, I don't recall seeing it. But it was unimportant because I was given the material that we were going to be used.
And just to be clear, you have no memory of ever being aware that the original product specified was an FR5000 product?
I don't believe so. I mean, I might have seen it on some of his drawings. I don't know if he called it FR5000 on his drawings. This is
I don't
Neil.
think we see it on the Studio E drawing. We don't think that it was marked as FR5000.
But no,
Well, presumably from a drawing point of view, it doesn't really matter, does it?
not at all, no.
Now, we know that the product was later changed to RS5000, and that was the insulation product used on the tower. When you joined the project in August 2014, we know your first meeting with Ray Bailey and Daniel Ankle-Jones was on
Yes.
the 12th of August 2014.
Yes.
Were you told at that point that the product was going to be a Celotex product?
I don't recall if they actually said it was going to be Celotex. I was told that it was going to be a rigid insulation.
Yeah.
So I would assume a Celotex or a Kingspan type product. But that thermal calculations had to be done to determine the actual product.
Who was doing those thermal calculations?
As I understood, Dan,
Dan Ankle-Jones?
yes.
Did you ever discuss with Dan Ankle-Jones that there was a new product that had come onto the market? Did he ever discuss that with you
No,
that was called RS5000?
no.
Or that there was a change that they were making from one Celotex product to another?
No, not at all.
Now, looking at paragraph 49 of your witness statement, this is HAR 30100419 at page 13. in the middle of that paragraph, sorry, just to pick it up, you've been asked the question at 4D, was the exterior of the building, including the cladding insulation, compliant with relevant building regulations, fire regulations? And in the middle there, 3 lines down, you say, in particular, the cladding was class 0, the insulation was suitable for use on buildings over 18 metres, according to the Celotex rain screen cladding compliance guide. Do you see that there?
Yes, yeah.
And if we also look at paragraph 54 of your witness statement on page 14, if we can look at 54 and blow that up. You say, my involvement came after the choices had already been made about the cladding and insulation materials, and I cannot comment on advice, information or assessments about these. Although, as stated above, I do recall reading the Celotex rain screen cladding compliance guide.
Yes.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
So can you help us? Why would you have been reading the Celotex rain screen cladding compliance guide?
I had to consider how it was going to be fixed to the building.
Yes.
So I wasn't reading it to the nth degree. I was looking for tables showing how many fixings and the types of fixings.
Yeah.
So it was from a structural point of view to make sure it was fixed to the building properly.
Yeah. Let's just pull up that guide. This is CEL 402047. Now that's what we think is the rain screen cladding compliance guide. Is that the guide that you read, as far as you were aware?
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember a pink guide with using Celotex over 18 metres written on the front.
Yeah. And if we go on to page 2, at the top of the page, you say this document provides guidance on complying with approved document B for external wall, provides a step-by-step guide to an alternative route to compliance for ADB B2 through meeting the performance criteria set out in BR 135 through testing to BS 8414. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Now, is your evidence that you simply wouldn't have been reading it?
I wasn't checking for compliance.
For that kind of information?
Not at all.
No. Did you ever have any discussions with anybody within Harley about anything that was said in this compliance guide in terms of compliance?
Not at all, no.
Kingspan K15, if we look at paragraph 42 of your witness statement, this is on page 11 of your statement. Paragraph 42, you say the insulation was Celotex RS 5000 rigid slabs and was cut to suit on site. However, I am aware that some Kingspan was used because of an interruption in supply of the Celotex. You see that there?
I do, yes.
When you say you were you aware at the time that you were working on the project that some Kingspan was used because of an interruption in the supply?
Yes.
Can you help us as to when you became aware of that?
I think there was a point where I happened to be in the office at Harley, and Ben was quite unhappy because his supplier had just told him at that point that they couldn't provide him the Celotex because of some kind of interruption of supply.
Yeah. And can you help us as to when that might have been on the project? I know it's difficult because it was a long time ago, but any idea?
Well, you would have to check through the purchase orders, and it would be days before he ordered the Kingspan, I would imagine.
Yeah.
It wasn't, I don't think it was a long time in advance. He obviously he found that out because he was trying to order the Celotex to go to site. So
Yeah. I mean, we've checked, and I believe I'm right in saying there was a purchase order in May 2015, and then some indication in one of the Ryden statements that some K15 was authorised later that year as well, in October
right.
2015.
Sounds right.
So we're still a little bit unclear about the history of this. Was it your understanding that K15 had to be ordered on more than one occasion because of an interruption with the Celotex supply chain?
No, I could tell you no more than I've just told you.
Okay. When Ben was saying he was really unhappy and that he wasn't going to get the Celotex, was anybody else in the office at the same time? Do you recall?
It was a relatively open office.
Yeah.
I couldn't honestly say who was there, but it wasn't just me and Ben.
Can you help us as to whether any assessments or investigations happened at that point about the compliance of the K15 for use on the Grenfell project?
I wouldn't know about that.
You can't help us with that?
Not at all.
We know that, and we saw earlier that rock wool duo slab, a mineral wool insulation product, had been used on previous Harley projects, including Ferrier Point.
Yeah.
Were you ever involved in any discussions about rock wool and why a different insulation product was being used from mineral wool on the Grenfell project?
I think at the time when Dan was doing the thermal calculations, it may have been mentioned that rock wool wouldn't be used because of the maximum zone we had to fill. So which is why we were going with the rigid insulation.
I see. But that was the only time that came up, as far as you were aware?
Yeah, and it's only a comment in passing.
Yeah. Can we go back now to the Harley specification for the product?
Yeah.
For the project, sorry, RYD 3046822, which we looked at not that long ago. And we can see that this document, we saw it earlier, the document was revised a number of times. And when we get to the window infill panels, we'll look at some of the revisions. Can you help us as to why the insulation behind the rain screen cassettes is never outlined in these specification notes?
All right, well, that's clearly an oversight. But I think the reason it didn't go on there in the first place is because thermal calculations were still being done.
Yeah.
So the final thickness and composition had not been agreed, and then I obviously produced this and it slipped under the net. It never ended up on the drawing.
I see. So you think it was an oversight rather than a deliberate decision not to include it in the specification?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely an oversight. And I don't think anyone was unclear as to the material that was being used.
Whose responsibility would it have been to have picked up that the insulation wasn't in these specification notes, do you think?
It was my responsibility to put it on there. And then you would expect the team to pick it up and maybe even the architect to pick it up. But as I said, as it was an oversight and everyone knew the material that was being used, I don't think there was any concerns there.
Yeah. You see, when this document is used subsequently, and I appreciate you weren't involved in this, for example, sent to building control,
Right.
wouldn't have told them what the insulation product was.
No, but I would guess data sheets would have been issued, would they not?
Well, I think you're guessing at that.
Yeah,
but we'll
yeah.
stop there. Can you also help us, if you go within this same document to some of the drawings that are attached to it, if we look, for example, at page 4, where you've drawn the insulation, you've used that wriggly line.
Yeah.
Do you agree that that is known in some quarters as a symbol for mineral wool insulation?
No, it's a generic hatch pattern for insulation.
So you don't agree that, or you don't accept that that's telling you a bit more than that, that it's telling you it's a mineral wool insulation?
No, I don't think anyone read that assuming that was mineral wool.
If we look at a drawing from Ferrier Point, if we can go to SEA 402678. This is a drawing from Ferrier Point. Sorry, it's on its side.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, that's great, yeah. So this is a previous Harley project. we know you were sent some details of this project right at the very
Yes,
beginning. The point I want to discuss with you is here on this drawing, which is a pretty detailed drawing. I think it's a 1:2 drawing, yes?
Yeah, yeah.
We do get the type of insulation labelled on the drawing, 2 layers of 100mm rock-wool duo-slab rigid insulation.
That's correct, yeah.
Now, can you help us as to why, for example, we see that on the Ferrier Point drawings, but we can't see in any of the Harley drawings for Grenfell any label identifying the insulation by name?
The materials would all be listed on the drawing 100.
On the drawing 100?
Yeah, the specification drawing we were looking at just before this.
But I think you accepted that the insulation wasn't there, was it?
Yeah, as an oversight, yeah.
That's an oversight,
Yeah,
I see. So, but not only do we not see it listed in the specification notes, we can't ever see any labels in any of the Grenfell drawings, correct me if I'm wrong, where
Yes.
you have indicated in a label what the nature of the insulation was.
Yeah, no, quite often on, on virtually every job actually, we tend to label as little as possible because if there are changes, then you have to change every single drawing rather than change one drawing. So if the architect says, okay, we're not using Celotex, we're using Kingspan,
Yeah,
I would have to change every single drawing
I see.
as opposed to just one drawing.
Yeah. I see. So what you're saying is it's that key, it's that specification list that tells you, for example, that it's Rainabond panels, and it should have told us that it was RS 5000 Celotex insulation. And that's your guide to the rest of the drawings.
That's correct, yeah.
And you can't help us as to why someone's done something different here at Ferrier Point by actually labelling the insulation.
Different draftsmen, different ways they work.
Yeah. Cavity barriers. We can move to that subject now.
Okay.
At the time of the Grenfell project, were you aware of building regulation functional requirement B34, that the building shall be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited? Were you aware of that?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. What was your understanding of the distinction between a cavity barrier and a fire stop?
A fire stop goes on the inside of the building. The cavity barrier goes in the external cavity.
Right. If we can look at approved document B, this is CLG 50224, and pick it up on page 82. Here we've got, oh, sorry. So this is section 9. We looked before at section 12 of ADB, but we see cavity barriers are dealt with in detail in section 9. Is that correct? In
Yes,
ADB.
yeah.
Were you aware of that at the time of the Grenfell project?
Yes.
Yeah. And we see in 9.1 that there's a general warning about concealed spaces and cavities. And in the final sentence it says, as any spread is concealed, it presents a greater danger than would a more obvious weakness in the fabric of the building.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And then it says provisions for cavity barriers are given below for specified locations, and we get diagram 33 of ADB. Can we just have a look at that there?
Mm.
Do you agree with me that diagram 33 is clear that window openings should be closed with cavity barriers?
In this instance it is, yes. Mm.
When you say in this instance it is, what does that mean?
Well, this is a multi-purpose diagram.
Yeah.
I think when you first read this, as it's in section B3, that applies to internal spread of flame. So I would look at that and see that as being a cavity wall. Cavity barriers required between the skins of brickwork.
Right.
Okay, when you get to B4, it does refer back to this this diagram.
Yes. 12.10.
And I think the diagram could be far clearer if it's really to apply to external spread.
I see, but why can't we extrapolate? I appreciate this seems to be a standard masonry wall type construction in this diagram, but why can't we extrapolate out from this into a rain screen construction? And just looking at the window detailing, isn't it quite easy to transpose those little grey cavity barrier lines below and above the window into the cavity we have in a rain screen?
Yes, yeah.
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 Did you consider at the time of your work on the Grenfell project that diagram 33 would have some application to the work you were doing?
Yes, to a degree, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And if we can look at paragraph 9.3 of ADB, which I think is on the next page, 83. At the top of that page, under junctions and cavity closures, it says at 9.3, cavity barriers should be provided to close the edges of cavities, including around openings. Do you see that there?
Yes, yeah.
Now again, I put this to Mr. Ankethall-Jones, and I want to put it to you. It couldn't be clearer, could it? Certainly in this part, that cavity barriers needed to be provided around openings.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Prior to starting on the Grenfell project, was that your understanding?
I understood.
Of the basic position that cavity barriers should be provided around window openings?
Yes, as one route to compliance, yes.
When you say as one route to compliance, what does that mean?
There are many routes to compliance.
Does that mean that you could get a fire engineered solution by a fire engineer which designs your external wall in a way that's different to ADB but still meets the functional requirements of the building regulations?
Definitely, yeah.
On the Grenfell project, did you think that you were following approved document B and the main guidance that you had, or did you think there had been a holistic fire engineered approach to that external wall?
I didn't give it a vast amount of thought, but I did know that the architect was backed up with a fire engineer.
I see. So are you saying that
We followed the architect's advice.
Yes, I appreciate that, but are you saying that you did think that there might well be a fire engineered approach for Grenfell?
Yes.
We'll look at it in a minute. We know that when you talk about, in paragraph 50 of your statement, the research you did on cavity barriers when you were looking for assistance about their rating,
Yes.
you did consult ADB.
Yes. Yeah.
Would suggest to you that that might indicate that you did think ADB was applicable and that there wasn't a special fire engineered solution.
I was getting very little feedback from the rest of the team, and that is my only real point of call to research from the ADB.
Yeah. Were you ever told in terms, by the way, we're not following ADB, we've got our own design here, it's different, don't worry about it? Were you ever told that?
No, I was
No.
always told to follow the architect's drawings.
I see. Did you think that there might be any difficulties complying with diagram 33 and section 9 on cavity barriers on the Grenfell project?
Any difficulties? In what way?
We'll take windows.
Yes.
Did you ever consider that what you were doing at Grenfell made it difficult for you to comply with the requirement for cavity barriers around windows?
Yes, because of the shape of the cladding, it wasn't a simple way of sealing the perimeter adequately.
Was it your objective to seal the perimeter of the windows? Is that what you set out to do?
No, not at all, because the architect's drawings didn't show that.
Right.
But it's quite clear because of the design of the building, it wasn't a simple solution. So one would imagine that the architect had taken steps to consider another solution. This may well have been a fire-engineered solution.
Right. Did you ever query expressly with the architect and say, can you just help us? Are we putting cavity barriers around the windows, and if so, where? Did you ever have that conversation with them?
Not specifically, no, but it was raised internally, and we did start various email trails on that.
Now, let's look at what Studio E's drawings showed in terms of cavity barriers. Just before we do that, I just want to look at paragraph 19 of your witness statement, HAR 30100419 at page 4. In paragraph 19, you say, in terms of the Studio E drawings I was sent, I believe I would have paid most attention to the following drawings, and you list out a number of drawings.
Yes.
And at H, we see detail section sheet 1279061200.
Yeah.
And at M, over the page, we get their proposed typical bay plans section and elevation. It's a drawing we'll go to and we've looked at a number of times, 1279061100.
Yeah.
And you go on to say in paragraph 20 that the key aspects of the external facade design came from Studio E drawing 1279061110 revision 00. So the one you've got in item M.
Yes.
So that was a pretty important drawing, wasn't it, in terms
That's right.
of showing
Yes.
Studio
110 and
E's-
120, I remember them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you paid particular attention to those drawings when you were doing your work.
Yes, yeah.
Can we then turn to the drawing 110? This is at SEA 402499, and we will need the offline version. Great. Yes, that's it. And I want to look at the proposed section in the right-hand top corner first, the proposed section typical bay. If we can zoom in on that. Yes, that's... Can you read that okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
And if we look 4 labels down on the right, we see ensure horizontal and vertical cavity barriers meet tightly. And it's referring back P10435. That'll be a reference back to the MBS specification, won't it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And we can see a little hatched rectangle, and it's immediately at the head of the window, isn't it?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. And we can also see that replicated at the bottom of that section as well, one label up.
Yeah, so at the head of the next window down.
At the head of the next window, exactly. Yeah. And then if we now pan out, and I want to go to the proposed plan window level at the bottom left. Yes, it actually doesn't matter whether you take which sketch you take, because I think the sill level and window level, we get the same detail. But what we see here on the very left is a detailing for the column, and the very bottom label, cavity fire barrier in line with compartment wall structure, leave no gap to cladding.
Correct.
And we've got a hatched rectangle kind of in the middle of that part of the column. So you were clear that you needed a cavity barrier there, yes?
That's right, yeah.
But then right at the jamb of the window, where the column meets the window jamb, do you see that there is another little hatched area?
Yeah.
It's not a rectangle, it's a more irregular shape.
Yeah.
Now, my question is, when you looked at these drawings, did you interpret that to be a cavity barrier down the window jambs?
Not at all.
Why not?
It's shown on the detail above, and that's not beside a window. If you look at detail 1 above, scroll the page down a little bit.
Yeah. So you mean to go to the sill level?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, let's go up to that. Do we not see an area of hatching at that point as well?
Yes, but if it was a cavity barrier to go around the perimeter of the window,
Yeah,
there is no window in that detail, is there?
yeah. When our expert looked at this drawing, he was not clear whether a cavity barrier was marked there. Did you ever think to go back to the architect and check and query and ask whether at that window jamb position there ought to be a cavity barrier?
No, we did discuss it at Harley in one of our round table meetings. But if it was to go around the window, then he would have shown another one at the base of the window as well.
So what did you think it showed?
I think it's just him showing that there's another type of insulation pushed right into the groove where the concrete spandrel panel comes across.
Couldn't that have been compressible insulation in gaps, potentially mineral wool, which was intended to act as a cavity barrier in that location?
He seems to have labelled everything else. I don't. If it was something different from everything else, I would have expected that labelled.
Do you agree? There does seem to be different size hatching in that area, so something seems to be a little bit different in that area from what's shown in the spandrels and on the column more generally.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, you said you did discuss that in Harley, but you concluded that if the architect had wanted cavity barriers around the window, they would have shown it at sill level, yes?
That's right, yes. Yeah.
Who did you have that discussion with?
Certainly with Ray, maybe Ben. Don't know if Dan was in that one.
And can you help us as to when, how far into the project was it that you had that discussion?
It was at the point that we were laying out the cavity barriers, so that was a little bit later.
March 2015, we see some discussion about cavity barriers?
Maybe a little, probably a little bit before then, but yeah.
I see.
We'd had many conversations before we started these email trials.
And did nobody say during that discussion, well, why don't we check with the architects? Why don't we raise this expressly with them and get them to confirm?
Harley are my client, and I was taking instructions from Harley.
Yeah. That wasn't my question. Did nobody say during that discussion, why don't we check with the architects? Was that not raised as a possible way of resolving this?
I don't recall what was said, but it wouldn't have been my place to actually do that anyway.
Did you get the impression...
Well, I'm sorry, can I just interrupt you? You say that, but you were translating the architect's drawings into fabrication drawings, if I can use those terms. So you needed to understand yourself what was shown on the architect's drawings, didn't you?
Correct. But obviously everything that Harley told me to do would supersede that. I mean, by the same argument, you could say these drawings actually show face-fitted panels, which we didn't do. There was obviously a certain level of agreements between Harley, Ryden, architect.
Yeah, but I'm sorry to press you on this, but I mean, it sounds from what you've told us already that there was some debate within Harley, to which you were a party, as to what these drawings did actually show.
Yeah.
And you didn't think it appropriate to say, well, I really need to hear from the architect so I can do the right sort of drawing.
No, I didn't. I was happy with advice from Harley.
Even though they hadn't done the drawings?
Yes. Yeah, they were the cladding specialists. They obviously felt that it wasn't necessary.
Yeah.
Or they'd had discussions, I don't know.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
You knew, though, didn't you? I think you've confirmed that in general terms you knew there's a requirement for cavity barriers around windows. You knew that before the project. Yeah. And you've also confirmed, and I took you to lots of the guidance, that you knew how important cavity barriers were in terms of preventing unseen fire spread.
Correct, yeah.
They're not an insignificant detail, are they? They're not an aesthetic point. They are potentially relevant to life safety.
Correct, yeah.
Did you get the impression at the meeting during the discussion that it was more convenient for Harley not to install cavity barriers around the windows, because actually it's quite a fiddly, difficult thing to get right, and that they were looking for a way of deciding that they didn't have to provide them around the windows?
No, that's not definitely not the way they would operate.
So give us a sense of the nature of the discussion. How did it go? Can you help us any more?
It's an awful long time ago.
Was anybody within Harley advocating for cavity barriers around the window? Was there an actual debate and a difference of view? Or was everybody agreed that simply because they weren't shown at sill level, you could conclude that they weren't required around the windows?
No, I think they're not. If they were required around the windows, we would have 2 cavity barriers, or we'd have 3 cavity barriers in each of those voids, and the architect only shows 1. Sorry, on the vertical section. These are the planned sections.
Sorry, just explain that again. If they were required
Yes.
around the windows...
If you move to the right hand of the drawing,
Yeah.
and if we can go up, that's it. So that the top detail, section 3,
Yes. Yeah.
shows only 1 cavity barrier in each of the cladding zones.
Yes, but that's a section. It's not clear that that's a section which interfaces with a column, is it? That could be a section anywhere across the window. And what that's telling you is, in that location, you need one at the head. But why does that tell you anything about... I appreciate that tells you something about the sill.
Yeah,
Why does that tell you anything about the jamb?
because this is all interrelated, isn't it? The window is the full width between columns. So that cavity barrier hits the column.
But you've got a label, ensure horizontal and vertical cavity barriers meet tightly. So you know there's a vertical cavity barrier needed to meet tightly with that one.
Yes, and it shows it on the other 2 details, going up on the slant up the side of the column.
But how did you know that the other little irregular hatched area might not be a vertical cavity barrier which was meant to meet tightly with the one at the head of the window?
Well, it goes against... If the architect was considering cavity barriers to go around the windows and cavity barriers in the voids, as shown on diagram 33, we should be looking at 3 cavity barriers on this drawing. But we're not.
I see.
I wouldn't expect the architect to expect you to have cavity barriers up the sides
Yeah.
and not across the bottom and middle of the zone.
But just going back to the discussion you had within Harley, was nobody saying, yes, but we know from ADB and we know from other guidance, there's lots of guidance out there. It's all very clear that cavity barriers are required around windows. So let's go back to the architect and check that, because we know these are really important.
Well, I mean, by virtue of following his drawings, we produced our drawings and he's approved them. You can expect that he's happy that there is conformance.
But for a detail that's that important, it's important in terms of life safety, external fire spread, internal fire spread, breaking out into the cavities. Why wouldn't you want that expressly flagged and considered carefully by all the design team?
My superior, my client, gave me confidence to do exactly what I did, which was to follow the architect's drawings.
Did Harley tell you in terms that you did not need to provide cavity barriers around the windows?
No,
They didn't.
no. They said follow the architect's drawings.
So was it in fact your interpretation of the Studio E drawings that we ended up with, or was it an instruction you were provided via the Harley meeting?
It's a combination of the 2. As I keep saying, this still shows items that weren't translated to the building, such as face-fixed zinc rain screen panels.
I see. Mr. Chairman, this is a long topic, and I think this is as good as any moment for a
Good
break.
point.
Yes.
Are you doing quite well?
Yes, I am. I am doing well.
Shall we say 20 to 12 then?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. We're going to have a break then, Mr. Lamb. We'll come back at 20 to 12. Usual rules apply, please. No
Okay.
talking to anyone about your evidence
No
while
problem.
you're out of the room. Thank you very much. Good. Thank you. 20 to 12, please. Yes, would you ask Mr. Lamb to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Lamb?
Yeah, fine.
Ready to continue? Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, can we have back on the screen that Studio E drawing, or set of drawings that we were looking at, SEA 402499 in the native version? Yes, and I want to put to you a number of points about this. Would you agree that when you look at this and the level of detail we have here, that it was obvious that these are very early drawings done by an architect, giving an indication of the external wall? They're not detailed drawings, and that it would have been obvious to you and to Harley that your job was to be developing this design, to take it to the next stage, and that might well include developing the design of the cavity barriers.
I don't think I agree with that. I think they are quite detailed as far as an architect's drawing is concerned. They may not be at a suitable scale, but with being able to zoom in electronically, I think it tells you most things that are required.
So we know that the NBS specification identified, say, the CWCT standard
Yes.
that had to be complied with. We know that there's reference to fire breaks in accordance with the building regulations. Can you help us as to why you and Harley didn't understand that in terms of the cavity barrier strategy, your job was to take this, but to take it to the next level, develop the design, and develop it in a way that was compliant with approved document B and other industry guidance at the time, all of which was clear that cavity barriers were required around the windows?
It wasn't my understanding that that was what we were doing,
And how did you attain that understanding that that wasn't what you were doing?
because I was told to follow these drawings and follow the advice from Harley.
The hatched area on these drawings down the side, if we can zoom into that again at the proposed plan sill level, or indeed the proposed plan window level. Would you agree that the kind of hatching that you have there, the type of hatching, is indicative of a solid material in that location? Is that telling you it's a solid?
Well, it's the same hatching as the insulation that goes around the front of the column.
But it's not, is it? It's tighter, it's smaller, and it's in a different orientation.
Yes, yeah.
And the point I'm putting to you is that that would have indicated to you that potentially down that interface between the column and the spandrel, down the sides of the windows, there should have been a solid down that side.
Well, I don't understand what the architect is showing there. I don't think it's obvious that it's a cavity barrier to go around the windows, because the other details don't back that story up. So maybe it needed more clarity.
Can I just ask you this? Because it goes to the question of how detailed the drawings are.
Yes.
If you look at the what we currently got on the screen, the bottom left-hand drawing, you
Yes.
see what I think is a cavity barrier on the right-hand side of the column.
That's right, yeah.
Now, did you understand that a cavity barrier was also to be introduced on the left-hand side
No.
so they matched?
No.
Right. So let's go over to the next column.
Yeah.
There are no cavity barriers in a comparable position on that column.
No.
Is it your understanding that there weren't to be any cavity barriers around that column?
As long as the distance between cavity barriers didn't exceed, I can't recall, the 10 or 20 metre minimum requirement.
So you might expect there to be one on the third column that's not on the in the picture, sir.
Possibly. If you look at the column on the left, this is clearly a party wall column,
Yes.
but the column on the right looks to me like an internal wall column.
Exactly. I think that might be the explanation, to be
Right.
fair to Mr. Lamb. I think that what we see on the left is a cavity barrier where there's a compartment wall.
Yes.
Yes.
It's shown vertically there, and there's not one on the right. And I think, from memory, thinking back to Dr. Lane's report from phase
that may
one,
be the explanation then.
I think that wasn't something she was criticising, the lack of vertical cavity barriers down that column. But what we are seeing on both columns, Mr. Lamb,
Yeah.
either side of the window is a more intense area of smaller hatching. And we'll keep coming back to this, but my point to you is that shouldn't that at least have prompted a line of inquiry back to the architects as to what they intended?
I discussed the element of cavity barriers with the technical team at Harley
And you were told?
to draw it as we've just discussed, with one vertical cavity barrier and a horizontal cavity barrier as shown in the other detail.
And is it right that, is it your evidence that at the time you had those discussions, you were aware that this was a departure from the guidance given in approved document B, which requires cavity barriers around window openings?
Loosely, but I was also aware that there are other routes to compliance, a fire engineered solution.
If you were even loosely aware that this was a departure from approved document B, wasn't the common sense approach to ask for a clear instruction, either from Harley or from Studio E, or both, making clear whether or not cavity barriers were required around the windows?
I asked Harley what to do, and I did exactly what they told me to do.
Okay, let's keep going. I now want to turn to the other drawing that you said in your witness statement was a key drawing that you were interpreting and turning into your more detailed drawings. This is drawing 120, and if we go HAR 30s10424.
Yep.
And if we look on the right-hand side, we can see this is between floors 19 and 20.
Yeah.
Do you see that there? And this also shows a hatched cavity barrier immediately above the head of the window.
Correct.
Do you see that there? And I believe if we pan out, so on the left-hand side, we believe we found some hatching above the window. Yeah. So right at the top of the page,
Yeah.
horizontal cavity barrier to seal both rain screen cavity and cavity between CM board and existing concrete structure. Do you see that there?
Yes.
What location is that in there? Can you help us? Can we just see the top of the entire top of the drawing?
I mean, that's at the walkway level,
Yeah.
which would be, is that second floor? First or second floor?
And we can see a hatching immediately above the head of the window, yes?
On that one, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, if you were merely transposing across what was shown in these drawings over to your drawings,
Yes.
do you accept that you would have maintained the positioning of these cavity barriers as shown in these drawings?
As close as possible, yes.
I see. Okay, well, we'll look at that in a moment when we come to your drawings. Let's look at your witness statement at this point. If we go HAR 10419, page 12, paragraph 44. You tell us there that the cavity barriers were Siderise Lamatherm.
Yeah.
The vertical cavity barriers were Siderise Lamatherm RVG, supplied in stock slabs and cut to suit on site. The horizontal cavity barriers were Siderise Lamatherm RH25G, ventilated intumescent cavity barriers, and were cut pre-cut, oversized by Siderise and trimmed to suit on site. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And who was it that specified the Siderise Lamatherm product as appropriate cavity barriers for this project? Can you help us on that?
Yes, I was told by Harley that that was a product we would be using.
Did you, or to your knowledge anybody else within Harley, ever make any investigations with Siderise as to whether these cavity barriers had been tested in a rain screen system?
No. Or not, certainly from my point of view, I didn't. I don't know if anyone else had.
That was not something that occurred to you to check?
No.
And the horizontal cavity barriers had an intumescent strip, is that correct?
That's correct.
What was your understanding of the purpose of the intumescent strip?
The intumescent strip would expand when heat was in the cavity to close the compartment off, so flame and air could not travel.
And your understanding was that that would work with an aluminium composite material panel on the outside of the barrier?
I wasn't considering the material on the outside, but certainly I was aware this is how cavity barriers worked, yes.
Yeah. Now, I want to look at what was being said during the project about cavity barriers. Let's turn to SEA 3011703. This is where Daniel Anquetil-Jones, on the 17th of September 2014, raises an RFI, which, did you understand that to mean a request for information?
Yes.
Yes. With Simon Lawrence, Simon O'Connor, Neil Crawford, Bruce Soon, so with Ryden and Studio E, CCing you in, you're CC'd at this point.
Yeah.
And he says, please find attached RFI 001, which relates to requirement of fire breaks. This may be something that has already been decided or may need confirmation from the local fire officer, as the opinion tends to vary. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Can you recall what prompted Daniel at this point to raise this question at this point?
At many points through the project, we discussed cavity barriers, and it may have been one of those discussions that prompted him to seek clarification.
So just to be clear, you had many discussions with Mr. Anquetil-Jones about cavity barriers?
General members of the team.
Including Mr. Anquetil-Jones?
Including Dan, yes.
Yeah. Let's look at the RFI itself. EXO 401291. So here we can see the RFI, dated the 17th of September 2014, query, please may you confirm the required extent of the horizontal fire breaks within the cladding areas. We believe that they will be required at every floor level on the vertical columns, but not in the area of cladding between windows. This is because there's no chimney effect here, and therefore the cladding will not add to the spread of fire. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So just to be absolutely clear, am I right that this request was a specific request about the extent of horizontal fire breaks on the columns? Yeah?
Not specifically at the columns. We believe it will be required at every floor on the vertical columns, but not in the area.
Is what's being said that we think that on the columns we need to put horizontal fire breaks at floor level, but we don't need to put horizontal fire breaks across the columns in the areas between windows because there's no chimney effect there?
It's how it reads, yes.
Can you help us with what your understanding was at the time of the query that was being raised?
I wouldn't have read I would have paid little store to the suggested solution. I would be waiting for a confirmation from the architect, or in this case, Ryden's, it looks like.
Would you agree with me that the question isn't, do we have to put cavity barriers around windows at the head, sill and jamb of the windows?
Correct, yeah.
Do you remember whether there'd been any consideration by you or within Harley of the relevant guidance? You've referred, we know at paragraph 50 of your witness statement, to a number of pieces of guidance, including ADB and CWCT guidance that you consulted at the time of wanting help on the rating of the cavity barriers.
Yeah.
Do you recall whether at this stage, this is earlier, 17th September 2014, there'd been any consideration of the guidance at this point?
Certainly not from myself. No.
Yeah. And you weren't aware that anyone else within Harley had had a look at the relevant guidance?
I wouldn't know.
When he talks about the risk of a chimney effect in the columns, no chimney effect here.
He's not talking about the chimney effect in the columns. I think he's talking about it between the windows, isn't he?
Is that how you interpret this?
Well, Ms. Granger, I did wonder whether whether the question in the box-headed query isn't directed to cladding areas in general, so that he's saying that we've got to put them in at every floor level of the vertical columns, but not in the area of the spandrels.
That is possible. Can you help us with that, Mr. Lamb?
Well, I agree exactly with what you say, yes.
Right. So you're saying there's no chimney effect there because
I'm not.
it's not on the column. Sorry, he's saying that.
Yeah.
So are you saying that this wasn't a discussion you had with Mr. Anketell-Jones, which then led to this RFI?
No.
So it didn't come from you?
No.
Okay. Now, can we turn now to HAR 408902? This is a column front nose detail.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yes.
We can see it went through a number of revisions, and we can see that on the 25th of March 2015, sorry, I apologise, we actually see at revision A on the 22nd of August 2014 at the bottom of there that the fire break was added. Is that right?
No.
No, front
fin
bracket
brackets.
added. We've then got fire break increase at revision D, if we can
That's right.
pan out. If we can just pan out and see the whole section. So does that mean you've changed the dimension of the cavity barrier in revision D?
That's correct. Different ratings of cavity barrier will have different thicknesses.
Yeah.
So at this point, I must have been informed that we were using whatever rating, and I've noted it on the drawing accordingly.
And we can see you've got that cavity barrier down the right-hand side of the column.
Correct.
Nothing on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
Did anyone ever give any consideration to whether a cavity barrier might be necessary on that very front nose joint? Was that ever discussed?
Not at all, no.
And that wasn't something that occurred to you in terms of a potential chimney effect up that column nose?
No, you wouldn't normally put cavity barriers behind the joints, or else we'd have them on every single joint on the cladding.
Well, I think we're talking about that specific gap that we see at the front between the two returns of the panels at the bottom, whether there should have been a cavity barrier in there, or at least thought given to a cavity barrier in there, given the potential for fire to propagate up that gap.
Not in my experience, you wouldn't normally.
Okay. And just to be clear, the guidance that you say you specifically considered on cavity barriers, did that come later in 2015 when there was a separate discussion about rating of cavity barriers or
Yes, I would have said so, yeah.
and fire stopping versus cavity barriers?
Yes.
Are you clear that you weren't consulting the guidance at this point in September 14?
Don't forget, I was only consulting the guidance for a little bit of help, which wasn't forthcoming.
Right, yeah. Can we now turn to HAR 403638? And this is an email chain between Neil Crawford of Studio E and Terry Ashton at Exova, into which you and a number of other professionals were copied, arising out of that RFI.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to look at on page 4, on the 18th of September 2014 at 11:08. There, the RFI is sent to Terry Ashton by Neil Crawford. We can see that.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we go up to page 3, at the foot of page 3, Terry Ashton responds at 11:33 and requests further details. Do you see he says, Neil, I've never seen details of what you're doing to the external walls. Do you have any cross-sections, elevations?
Yeah.
And then we can see these are sent to him by Neil Crawford at 12:18 in the middle of page 3. Please see us attached our sections and the initial drawings set we have had from Harley's. The initial drawings from Harley's are fairly limited, but they attempt to establish the basic approach. Now, is it right that at this time, so this is September 14, the thinking behind cavity barriers was relatively undeveloped within Harley?
I'd have to consult those particular drawings, but
Okay, well, we might come back to that. You say in your witness statement, if we can look at this paragraph 33, this is HAR 30100419 at page 9. You say this at the top of that paragraph. In relation to the cavity barriers, they were not items that needed to be dealt with immediately, as they did not have lengthy lead-in times, as the shelf angles, sill and head details and cladding panels did.
yes.
You see that there?
Yes.
And I think you alluded to this yesterday. Is it fair to say that the cavity barriers were not the design priority because, in terms of the supply chain, they were going to take less time to obtain?
Correct, yes.
Were cavity barriers added as an afterthought on this project?
No, not at all.
How early in the design process do you think you were considering cavity barriers with Harley?
Early in 15.
Early in
Around-
15?
Yeah. February, guess.
Because you just said that you don't think that RFI was something you were directly involved in.
No.
So from your point of view, it was in early 2015 that you began to discuss the cavity barriers with them?
I'd a guess, yes.
Yeah. Now, returning to that email chain we were looking at, HAR 403638 at page 3, and if we go the very bottom of page 2 and on to page 3, we get a reply from Mr. Ashton. We can see the start of that at the very bottom of the page,
Yeah.
after he's been provided with details. And he says this at the top of the next page: Neil, if the insulation in the cavities behind the rain screen cladding is combustible, you will need to provide cavity barriers as shown on your drawing number 127906120 in order to prevent fire from spreading from one flat to the one above, even if there isn't a continuous cavity from the top to the bottom of the building.
Okay.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then one email up, this advice gets forwarded to you from Mr. Crawford at 1550.
Yeah.
You're there. His main email is there to Daniel Anketel-James, but you are copied in.
Yes.
Please see the correspondence relating to this. And we can see Mr. Anketel-James's response above that. And he says, Neil, thank you for your response. The insulation is class 0. Therefore, after reading the correspondence below, I believe that the fire barrier in these locations will not be necessary. Can you confirm that this is acceptable? Kind regards, Daniel. You see that there?
Yeah.
And he also attached at this time the Celotex RS5000 data sheet.
Okay.
Did you read that comment by Mr. Anketel-Jones as meaning that because the insulation was class 0, it was non-combustible?
I didn't have any thoughts on his discussion regards insulation. However, I didn't believe that there was no requirement for fire barriers. I always believe that there should be a fire barrier in that zone.
What zone are you talking about there?
He's talking about, what does he say? Really, I believe that a fire barrier in these locations will not be necessary.
So,
I don't believe that statement.
yeah, that it was necessary in the spandrel zones. Is
That's
that what
right,
you're saying?
yes.
Yes. Did you ever think about that advice that was being given, the insulation is class naught,
No, not at all.
at the time? That
No.
wasn't something that struck you as odd or something that ought to be checked?
No.
You didn't ever query whether Mr. Anketel-Jones' understanding was correct?
No, it wasn't my place to do that, not unless I was concerned.
Did you think at the time that class naught was relevant to the choice of insulation product?
Again, no. I mean, I wouldn't expect flammable materials, but I wasn't considering the class of insulation there.
No, but my question was, at the time, did you think that class naught was relevant to the choice of an insulation product?
Well, it should certainly be class 0 or better. When you read diagram 40 in ADB 4, it's quite clear we should be using class O products.
As we looked at yesterday, there is a difference between national class naught and a concept of limited combustibility.
That's correct.
Were you aware at the time that there was a difference between class naught and limited combustibility?
I wasn't considering that in this case.
But were you aware at the time that there was a difference between national class naught and limited combustibility?
Yes.
You were?
Yeah.
What did you think that difference was?
I didn't consider the difference, to be honest. As far as I was concerned, class O is a suitable material.
But I think you said yesterday, am I right, that your understanding of limited combustibility was that it was a description of a limited type of combustibility?
Yes.
You weren't aware that it had a very specific technical definition by
No.
reference to specific tests?
No, because normally that would be prefixed by a class or a rating. That's a bit of a vague term.
If we turn back, or if we're carrying on actually with this email string and we go to a different email, HAR 40s, sorry, it is the same email. If we look at the bottom of page 1 of this string, we get a response by Mr. Ashton, where he says a material which has a class naught rating is not necessarily non-combustible, although the reverse is invariably true. Some class naught products will burn when exposed to a fully developed fire. Do you see that there?
Yes, yeah.
Do you remember seeing that at the time of the Grenfell project?
I don't know. This wasn't directed at me, but I'm sure it was in a historic trail.
I don't think this was sent to you, but does it follow from your evidence that you weren't made aware that this was the advice Mr. Ashton was giving?
I think he's arguing with Dan about the requirement for cavity barriers.
Yes, but
I
were
think
you...
they've sort of slipped off on an irrelevant point. We all know we should be putting cavity barriers at every level.
I see.
I think he's trying to say to Dan, of course we need cavity barriers.
Right.
Yeah.
But were you made aware of the advice that Mr. Ashton was giving on this issue at the time?
Not specific when you relate it to the class O is not necessarily non-combustible.
Did you ever raise any concerns about this line of thinking at the time?
Not at the time, no. But we certainly, by the time we got to February, March, it was getting to a point where we had to get this product on the wall. And it was a case of, guys, what on earth are we doing? This sort of a document is vague. We need proper clarity.
Mr. Ashton, at the end of that paragraph, is saying what isn't clear from the information to hand is whether or not there is a continuous cavity from top to bottom in any part of the cladding, apart from around the column casings, irrespective of the type of insulation. Do you see that there?
Yes, yeah.
Do you remember whether you were ever asked to help respond to that request for information about whether there might be a column in other parts of the cladding?
No, not at all. Dan was clearly dealing with that, wasn't
So you didn't get involved in that?
he? No.
Can we just look up to the top of this chain? We see there Mr. Crawford goes back to Mr. Ashton, and you are copied in there.
Yeah.
Hi, Terry, thank you. And then a question is asked of Daniel. Can you confirm your position in relation to Terry's comment below regarding combustibility and continuous cavity paths? Having just finished several weeks of fire-stopping checks on the Kensington Aldridge Academy, where John Hoban crawled into almost every conceivable cavity possible with a torch, including nearly falling through a suspended ceiling, we need to be clear on our position before going to building control. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Now, we can't find any response by Daniel confirming his position about the combustibility and continuous cavity paths. Do you remember ever discussing that with Mr. Anketel-Jones?
Not at all. No, definitely not.
So is your evidence that you simply didn't get involved in this discussion
No, I didn't. No.
or have an opinion on the points they were discussing?
No.
If we go then to SEA 30's11759, this is an email from you a few days later after this discussion has occurred, from you to Simon Lawrence, copying in Daniel Anketel-Jones, Neil Crawford, Bruce Soons. So it's on the 22nd of September 2014.
Yeah.
And you attach a set of drawings. Simon, please find attached drawings as raised in issue for final approval based on the architect's comments and discussions at our last meeting.
Yeah.
We shall shortly issue further details for consideration. You see that there?
Yeah.
And if we turn to the attached drawings themselves, this is RYD 50431. Yes, so there's a number of drawings in this pack, and we can just scan through them. Here's an elevation drawing.
Yeah.
Do you agree with me? There's no cavity barriers shown anywhere on this elevation.
Correct. They tend to be shown in details.
And if we go down this pack, I think if we just scan down, there's no cavity barrier there at sill level.
No.
If we can keep going. That's the head of the window, no cavity barrier there.
No.
That's the join with the column, no cavity barrier there.
Correct.
And there's no cavity barrier either, sorry if we go back to that drawing, no cavity barrier either at the interface between the window frame and the column,
No.
or indeed in the location which you were pointing out, shown on the Studio E drawings, further
Correct.
along the column.
That's right. Yes.
So can you just help us as to why these drawings at this stage weren't showing, even though we have got some detailed drawings, why were they not showing any cavity barriers?
But this is only, a week or two after the project started, and we were trying to get approvals for the cladding arrangement and the windows.
So it was envisaged at this stage, was it, that cavity barrier detailing would be provided later?
Correct, yes. Yeah. Maybe we should have said that on the email, but we didn't.
So you agree what we're seeing here is design development. You're taking the Studio E drawings, which we know, and we know we never got any even 1 in 5 drawings from Studio E, and you're turning them into something much more detailed here.
Correct, yes, yeah.
This is a 1 in 2 drawing, yes.
Mm.
Now, if we can now move forward in time, if we go to RYD 2727692, You sent an email on the 14th of January to Simon Lawrence and other members of the design team, Daniel Anketil-Jones, Neil at Studio E, Neil Crawford. And this is, I think you say in the email, please find attached a full set of drawings related to the upper 20 floors of windows, all now construction issue, and to be manufactured accordingly.
Yeah.
And you say clearly the design has varied much, but now all as we agreed prior to Christmas, and there's a large number of drawings there. Now, had anybody from Harley, such as Ray Bailey or Daniel Anketil-Jones, checked those drawings before you issued them?
No, that wasn't normal. Normally we would have a round table to discuss concept. These drawings were all revisions, so they would have been sent out to all parties to comment upon or consider at the same time.
Yeah. Now, I think what we can see is that none of these drawings contain cavity barriers.
Okay.
Let's just look at an example. If we go to RYD 2727697, so that's very similar to what we were just looking at, isn't it?
Yes.
From a drawing back in September. So we're now in January, 13th of January 2015, and it's marked construction in the little table on the bottom left.
Yeah.
And it's also headed, it's stamped, approved for construction.
Yeah.
Yeah? And can you help us as to why there are no cavity barriers shown in these drawings, including in this drawing here?
Is the cavity barrier not off the screen on the next drawing?
Let's have a look. Would it be the next one in the run? Is there another page to this? No, there isn't. Okay, we might have to, we'll check that.
Okay. I mean, we were obviously looking at it earlier, weren't we?
Yeah. We can see from the Harley drawing register, from the for the transcript, the reference is RYD 3065622, that this drawing was never revised after the 14th of January 2015. And it's right, isn't it, that cavity barriers were never included in that location in the middle of that page where the side of the window meets the column.
Yeah,
That's
not
correct,
in that
isn't it?
location, no.
Yeah. Now, despite these drawings saying approved for construction, 2 days later on the 16th of January, Neil Crawford emailed his comments. That email is at SEA 3012531. SEA 3012531. Yeah. So here, Neil Crawford's going back to you on the 16th of January 2015, with others copied in. Hi, Kevin. In line with our discussion over the phone, comments on drawings. And if we can turn to the comments, this is SEA 403040. We can see, so this is an elevation drawing where we've got lots of comments in red by Mr. Crawford.
Yeah.
Would you agree with me that there's no mention of cavity barriers in his annotations?
Correct, yeah.
And he's circled it B, conforms to design intent subject to incorporation of comments. We can see that from the stamp on the right-hand side.
Yes.
Now, did you ever have any discussions directly with Mr. Crawford about the location of cavity barriers in the design scheme?
I don't know, to be honest.
Was it something you were doing on the project, sometimes having discussions with Mr. Crawford?
Yes, sometimes, yeah. Yeah. Certainly at the design team meetings.
Yeah. But you can't help us as to whether you ever had a discussion with Mr. Crawford about where cavity barriers ought to be located.
Oh, well, there definitely was, but to what degree, I don't recall.
Do you recall anything about those discussions, what the topic of those discussions was when you were discussing cavity barriers with Mr. Crawford?
No, not in depth at all. I had so many discussions about cavity barriers.
Can you recall whether you ever had a discussion with him about what the requirements were of approved document B and diagram 33, and whether that could be applied to Grenfell?
No, we would never have that sort of a conversation.
No. Now, if we now turn on to an email from Siderise, so this is HAR 404013, dated the 3rd of March 2015. So this is, if we look at the top of the page, an email from Barnaby J. Carrick at Siderise to you, copying in Mark Stapley and Sue Shepherd. Who's Sue Shepherd?
I think she might have been at Siderise as well.
Yeah, okay. And he says, "Hi Kevin, we've reviewed the details you've kindly supplied and can confirm that they follow our recommendations. As the void is less than 325 millimetre and a 25 millimetre air gap is present, the cavity barrier size falls within our standard test data. And then regarding the RVG 3030, as shown in a particular detail, this also follows our recommendations. The brackets for the vertical cavity barrier only need to penetrate 2/3 to 3/4 of the cavity barrier. I hope this is of assistance. Should you have any queries, please do not hesitate to contact us." You see that there?
Yes. Yeah.
So you've obviously had a conversation with Siderise by this point. Is that right?
This follows, it sounds to me like it follows my checking the material availability from their catalogue. And I seem to recall their test data goes up to a certain void depth.
Yeah.
And I think it might be along the lines of the void was actually 350 millimetres.
Yeah.
But in their catalogue it says it's for 325, but it wasn't clear that it was 325 millimetre for the void rather than the product itself.
Yeah, I see.
Because there's an air gap. So
Yeah.
it's just clarification of that.
I see. Yeah. I think it's clear that you'd had some discussions with him if you go to the email at the bottom of this page 1.
Yeah.
Where you say to him in the previous email, "Further to our discussions, please find attached details for rain screen cladding using your RH25G
Yeah.
and RV." So those are the two different types of cavity barriers, horizontal and vertical, aren't they?
Yes, that's right.
So your conversation with Mr. Carrick, was it solely about the void depth and the testing that you've just referred to, or did you ask Siderise for any further advice at this stage about the cavity barriers?
No, it was all prompted from how this was fixed to the wall.
I see.
They had, at the time, they didn't have any details of both products, whether it was a new product to them or what, I don't know, but they had limited data.
And you say, "Please find attached details for rain screen cladding."
Yeah.
By that, do you mean the drawings?
Yeah, it would have been a
Yeah.
couple of typical drawings.
Did anyone from Siderise comment on the positioning of the cavity barriers in those drawings?
I don't believe so, and I wouldn't have expected them to unless we'd specifically asked them.
Right. Can we turn now to an email sent from you to Simon Lawrence, copying in the design team on the same day? So this is SEA 30012850. So this is you on the 3rd of March 2015 to Simon Lawrence, copying in others, including Daniel Ankerton-Jones, Neil Crawford, Mark Stapley.
Yeah.
Ben Bailey is also copied in there, we see. And you say, Simon, please find attached drawings now showing the fire breaks, both horizontal and vertical. We assume a requirement of 90 min integrity and 30 min insulation is sufficient. If not, please advise. And then you say this, the vertical breaks are not on all columns, just party walls. I think that's the point we were discussing with the chairman earlier.
Exactly, yeah.
About whether some columns didn't have a vertical cavity barrier.
Correct, yeah.
It wasn't along a party wall, yes. What was it that had prompted you to include cavity barriers on these drawings at this stage? Can you remember? So this is the 3rd of March 2015.
I think what was prompted is we were getting close to the point at which we were going to start installing things on site. So this had to be cleared up. We couldn't start hanging cladding on the building without the cavity barriers being finalised.
Yeah, so it become time critical.
Yes, yeah.
Had you discussed cavity barriers around this time with Harley? Had you had a roundtable meeting with them to discuss it?
Yeah, certainly beforehand. Then, yes.
And who do you remember discussing cavity barriers with before this point?
Earlier on would have been Dan, but certainly Ben and Ray.
Would it be fair to say that cavity barriers at this point were being included as a late amendment to drawings?
Not at all. We always knew that we were going to get to this point.
Yeah. So you wouldn't accept that this was a relatively late stage to be adding the cavity barriers
No.
after the window design was completed and work on site had begun?
No, not at all.
And had you had a discussion about precisely where to put the cavity barriers before producing these documents?
Well, we had discussed it in the office, and these were issued for their comment.
And again, I keep trying to pin you down.
Yes.
I know it's difficult.
It's the
but
typical round table comment
yeah.
that I would attend the office once a week or a fortnight. Who was at that round robin discussion would vary. But,
had you consulted the guidance that you refer to at paragraph 50 of your witness statement, ADB, the CWCT guidance, had you consulted that by this stage on the project?
yes, definitely.
You had?
Mm.
What did you consulted it in relation to? What were you...
Just to find clarity. And there was no clarity.
I see. So you're confident that before this point, you've looked at it to find clarity on what the rating of the barriers should be. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
And specifically for that purpose only?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you'd issued several drawings for the windows in January 2015, and we can see that you reissued only some of them again in March 2015. Can you help us as to why you didn't revise all of the drawings showing windows at that point to add cavity barriers?
Maybe they didn't need it.
What we see from the attachments to the email, you can see them listed there, is that you revised drawings 200, 201, 202, 301 and 305. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that is only a couple of...
And then
Yeah, I would guess that covers the 20 floors of windows, does it not?
well, let's look at drawing. This is drawing 200, SEA 403156. So here we see the elevation, and now what we can see is there's dotted lines on the columns and on the spandrels with the label fire break.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And those are the cavity barriers. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's a generic term for cavity barriers or fire stops.
And we can see at the bottom in the table that these were added, fire breaks added on the 3rd of March 2015.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Why did you use the word fire break when you were referring to cavity barriers in this elevation drawing?
It's just a generic term that we often would use.
Would you ever use the term cavity barrier?
Up before Grenfell, I would probably not. No.
No. And was that because you were predominantly a curtain walling and glazing specialist? So your experience prior to Grenfell might have been on fire stopping, but not cavity barriers?
Well, I don't think I would have called them fire stops either.
So would you have called both a fire break?
Yes, generically, yeah.
And you didn't think that it was appropriate to distinguish between whether you were talking about some fire stopping or a cavity barrier?
No, because I don't think there's any confusion. You couldn't put a fire stop in those locations.
And I think it's clear to see that what we don't see, if we can pan out again, is we don't see cavity barriers around the sides of the windows, do we?
No.
They're at some distance away from the windows.
A little way, yeah.
And we don't see cavity barriers specifically around the head, sill or jambs of the windows themselves, do we?
No, we've got the one single compartment as shown on the architect's drawings.
Do you agree that that positioning and location of cavity barriers would not prevent fire spreading into the cavity immediately adjacent to the windows?
Not immediately adjacent, no.
So we'll look at it on the 1 in 2 drawings shortly, but we've got cavities, haven't we? Take the head of the window there. There's going to be a cavity immediately above that window, isn't there?
That's right, yeah.
Where there's a return of the panel immediately above it, and then the fire break is now coming some distance above the head of the window.
Yes, you just want to bear in mind that this is the location of these on this drawing is a little bit indicative. When you look at the details, they're a bit close at the top of the window, but just for visual ease, they've been moved away from the window slightly.
And I want to put it to you again, why did you not, when doing this drawing, include cavity barriers around the window, as well as any other cavity barriers in the system more generally?
This was the only requirement.
Only requirement from who?
From Harley and the architect's drawings.
Now, this configuration differs at the head of the window from what was shown on the Studio E drawings, doesn't it?
It does a little bit, yes.
A little bit. The one we saw earlier at the head of the window by Studio E was immediately at the head of the window, wasn't it?
Correct, yes.
And this is raised up to come some way into the spandrel.
Yeah, it's as if you can throw up the detail above the window,
Yeah.
you'll see it's close to the window without any interruptions.
When you say close to the detail without any interruptions, what do you mean without any interruptions?
Above the window, is it possible to find that drawing that shows the detail of that cavity barrier? Our drawing above the window?
We'll check.
It will make explanation far
The
easier.
next one. Yeah, it's the next drawing we're going to come to.
Brilliant.
Yes, let's do that now then. Yeah, RYD 50220. Yes. So this is the head of the window. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And we can see you've added the honeycomb cavity barrier
That's right, yeah.
into the spandrel section
Yeah,
of this configuration. And it's not immediately at the head as shown on the Studio E drawings, is it?
that's correct, yeah.
Would you agree with me that that's a worsening of the cavity barrier strategy?
Not
Because
necessarily.
fire, sorry, let me just finish
Yeah,
my
sorry,
question.
yeah.
Because fire has the potential to go up and into the return of the panel and into that gap before the cavity barrier.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. What do you mean by that?
Well, the architect shows the position of the cavity barrier tight on top of the window,
Yes.
but the window hangs down below the structure. So you wouldn't expect to put a cavity barrier where it can't be backed up by the concrete structure. So for one, you would have to put it at least at the bottom of that concrete floor slab. The second thing, as this is a refurbishment, the concrete isn't crisp and flat and straight as it's shown on that drawing. It's quite a deflection. So the aluminium, this special profile at the head of the window, there would be gaps between that and the concrete. So if it was mounted on the aluminium profile, fire could get behind the cavity barrier, and you would also have to contend with the cavity barrier sealing over all the fixings. So that appeared to be the cleanest, safest position.
Why couldn't you have used compressible mineral wool in that location to create a cavity barrier at the head of the window?
I'm sure lots of options would be available, but this is the option that was proposed and accepted.
I'm going to show you a diagram from Mr. Hyatt's report at this stage. If we go to PHYR 603 at page 66. And if we can blow up that figure. Now, what Mr. Hyatt's done is take your drawing, yeah?
Yeah.
And he's indicated where, in his opinion, and he'll be asked about this in due course, where the cavity barrier should have been if following approved document B, section 9, paragraph 9.3. And he's put it immediately at the head of the window frame, lower than where you've put it. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's what he's shown, yes.
And do you agree that that was a perfectly possible thing to have done, that it was buildable in that way?
Well, as I say, I think he's shown it too low, and he's assuming that the substrate that aluminium angle is bolted to is flat, which it clearly wouldn't be.
Just break that down. Why has he shown it too low?
I don't think it should be hanging below the concrete, because the fire protection, the rating of the product relies on a suitable substrate behind it.
But you're trying to protect the cavity, the fire from entering the cavity. So why wouldn't you try and put the cavity barrier immediately at the head so that the cavity is protected?
A fire in the flat can attack the back of that cavity barrier, and I don't think they're designed to resist at that point. They're designed to resist it at the front or the sides.
So are you saying that you don't think it would have been possible to put a cavity barrier in that location in that way, as shown by Mr. Hyatt?
I think lifting it up very slightly would be better, and then another solution would have to be added to that to protect between the aluminium bracket and the concrete also.
I see. Okay, well, I'm putting it to you that you should have had it lower. You should have had it immediately at the head, per the guidance, around openings, to help prevent fire from coming out of the window and getting into the rain screen cavity.
Well, a solution was offered and it was accepted.
So just to be clear, are you disagreeing with me that it would have been possible to do what Mr. Hyatt's saying?
It'd be possible to do exactly what he's shown, yes.
Yeah. And that would have been in accordance with the guidance given in approved document B, wouldn't it?
I don't believe so.
Why don't you believe that's in accordance with the guidance?
Because I think that they've not considered the rear of that cavity barrier is below the substrate.
So you're worried that fire might go up behind that, but then it's going to hit the concrete, isn't it?
But this is what I'm saying. There's a gap between the concrete and the aluminium angle. But what I'm getting at is that the product is being attacked from behind. It's coming along that back edge, which I don't think is appropriate.
Why not? I mean, these are mineral wool kind of blocks, aren't they, with an inch-metre strip on the edge?
And the thickness of the product defines its rating.
Yes.
Now, if that's hanging down in free space by 50% of its thickness,
Yeah.
it's not exhibiting the same properties as a full thickness.
You mean because it would be insecure that it's not properly fixed back to the concrete?
No, not at all, not at all. The flame is attacking that barrier halfway up the back edge.
Yes, but it's an inert material. That's the point. It blocks the fire and it blocks the smoke. That's what it's there to do.
Well, your implication is that any size of material that is inert would be adequate, and it's clearly not, because they come in different thicknesses to give different resistances.
But if you were worried about gaps at the back, isn't it possible around windows, and we'll look at an example of this later, to use compressible mineral wool and pack it into gaps? Isn't that sometimes a solution that's adopted when putting cavity barriers around windows?
It would still have to be a fire product. You couldn't just pack it with a mineral wool.
No, but
Yeah.
fine. You say it's got
But
to
it
be a
would
fire
have to be an engineered. You couldn't just say, oh, well, we've got a gap, so we'll pack some fire insulation in there. That would have to be referred to fire engineers to approve that.
I see. Maybe that's what was required on Grenfell, but what you've done here is just raise it up because...
Yes, I've offered a more robust solution for comment.
Did you ever check with anybody that that was more robust in terms of fire spread?
No, we're offering it to the professional team, the architect and his fire engineers.
So you expected them to check that that was an appropriate solution?
That's correct. All the drawings were issued to the team for compliance.
I see. And this, if we look at paragraph 34 of your witness statement, HAR 30100419, page 9, this is where I think you've just explained in your statement what you were referring to. In terms of the location of the cavity barriers on the spandrels, this was drawn above the aluminium fixings at the head of the window, as it was thought it was more effective to have them above these fixings, directly against the concrete and located within the span of the concrete floor slab. You see that there?
Yes, yes.
Now, who thought it was more effective to have them in that location? Can you help us?
Yeah, it was discussed at one of our meetings across the table at Harley.
And can you remember who was part of that discussion about moving that cavity barrier up?
Well, Ray would definitely have been.
Did you think it was more effective in that location?
Definitely.
And Ray Bailey thought it was more effective in that location?
Yes, yes. I agreed with him, yeah.
What about Daniel Anquetil-Jones? Was he part of that discussion?
Don't know.
And did you ever expressly flag this with the architects and say to them, listen, looking at your drawings and drafting the drawings, we've decided to move this. This is why we've moved it. This is why we think it's still effective. What do you think? Did you ever do that?
No, no.
And why not? Why would you not do that?
Because the whole issue of providing drawings for him to comment is that in itself. We don't ask him to check every item on the drawing. That is the process, that he's checking every item on the drawing.
I see. Your evidence to us so far has been that what you were doing was simply translating, you were just translating what the architect wanted into a drawing.
That's correct, yeah.
Do you accept if you were doing that, you would have put the cavity barrier at the head of the window?
There's areas where what the architect has shown are impractical, and you may make minor variations, which is the whole point of us sending the drawings back to him. If we were copying his drawings exactly, there would be no need to send any drawings back to him.
Yeah, so there is a design development going on at Harley's end, isn't there? And you're part of that process.
That's right, to make things fit the building, yes.
Now, just looking back at the drawing RYD 50220, this is the drawing produced on the 3rd of March. And I just want to look at what the annotations say. In that top left label, if we could zoom into that, where you have put the cavity barrier, you've put fire break cut around cladding rails.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, so was that a specific instruction that you were adding to these drawings about cutting fire breaks around cladding rails?
It was, as I understood, they would be installed because the cladding rails come into the zone. So they weren't going to come as a pre-cut item. They would be going to cut on site accordingly.
Did you ever consider how the integrity of the cavity barrier would be maintained if it was going to be cut around the cladding rail?
No, because I guess this is sealing the inside, but the cladding rail, the area of the cladding rail that you're implying is on the outside of the building.
No, it's not. It's on the inside. It's underneath the rain screen cladding.
But it's also on the outside because it's an open air gap.
Well, let's focus on the inside. What you had was a concrete face, and at intervals you had a cavity barrier coming across.
Complete, it wasn't interval.
And then where there was a cladding rail that came up the spandrel, the cavity barrier was cut so that the rail went right through the cavity barrier. Do you
That's
agree?
right, yeah, it was cut tight.
Yes, but you've still got the break in the cavity barrier where the rail goes. Do you agree?
Yes, but the rails are continuous, so there's no alternative.
Now, you've said to us earlier that you were concerned about gaps at the head of the window and the fire attacking the back of the cavity barrier if it was lower.
Yeah.
Why didn't you ever give any consideration to the gaps that would be created by the cladding rails as they went through the cavity barriers?
There were no gaps. It was cut tight to the cladding rails.
Yes, but the cladding rail itself was a channel through which the cavity barrier did not fit. Does that make sense? It didn't go through the middle of the cladding rail.
The front is, yes.
I'll show you. We'll come and I'll show you some pictures. And I think in Paul Hyatt's report we get.
I mean, this is
some help.
normal practice.
It's normal practice to cut around the cladding rail. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. As long as it's tight on the inside, you can do no more on the outside because it is a cladding, it's a continuous joint.
But wouldn't it have been possible to put the cavity barrier or put a piece of cavity barrier inside the shape of the cladding rail, the U shape of the cladding rail, so that you have a continuous cavity barrier along the spandrel?
But that would be exposed to the outside world then?
No, it was inside the rain screen.
Okay, I think we need to have a look at the detail.
Yeah, we can do that.
Before we leave this drawing,
Yes.
I confess to being not very good at reading drawings, but can you, with your practiced eye, tell me how far up this shows the cavity barrier above the head of the window?
It was discussed. It was as tight as possible
Yeah, but
to the.
what's the dimension as far as you can tell?
Yeah, I would say that was about, because this is a scale drawing. I would say that was about 175 to 200 millimetres. So it was actually quite a small zone.
I think we'll have a look over the lunch break, see if we
Right,
can
thank you very
find
much.
a dimension for that. 'Cause I think
Yeah,
we might.
I'm just interested to get
Yeah.
a feel for the dimensions. I find it quite hard to get that. Just
Yeah, I
from
think
my
we
own
might have some good
reading.
photographs and dimensions in Barbara Lane's first report,
Right.
so we'll do that.
Thank you.
Now, if we go on in the chronology, if we turn to SEA 50252, we can see, if we look at the email at the top of that page, that on the 6th of March 2015, so your email of the 3rd of March has prompted Neil Crawford to send an email on the 6th of March to Paul Hanson at RBKC Building Control, and you're copied in amongst others. Do you see that on the CC list?
Yes, yes.
And he says, "Hi Paul, following our conversation this afternoon, this reminded me of another issue where we are overcladding. What fire rating do we need to allow for within the wall build-up between apartments, see below and attached?" Do you see that there?
Yeah, yeah.
So he's asking about the fire rating.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us exactly what the issue was he was raising there? Was it about you've put the 90 minutes integrity and 30 minutes insulation is sufficient in your email?
No. I think this is referring to an architectural detail. This reminds him of another issue. Where we're overcladding, what fire rating do we need to allow within the wall build-up between apartments? So I think that's referring to the internal of the building.
No, I think he's asking, and I think we'll see it as we keep going, that within the cavity, the rain screen cavity, what fire rating do we need to allow for in the locations between apartments? So the horizontal cavity barriers, what rating should they be? Is that not right?
Another issue. But that's exactly what I've asked below. So why is it another issue, unless he's referring to his conversation?
That may be right. It may be that you've raised it and he's said that reminds me. But in fact, you're talking about the same issue.
Possibly, yeah.
Now, we can see you're copied into this email string. Was it as a result of this exchange that prompted you to look at approved document B?
No, I think I probably looked at it before. I mean, very close to this time. I mean, this is only 3 days after my email. I think it was literally around that time, probably before the 3rd of March. But
did you think to look at table A2 of ADB, which gives advice on the rating of cavity barriers?
I don't recall.
It appears that you rang Siderise and spoke with Sue Shepherd at this point.
Mm-hmm.
We can see that if we go to HAR 403999. So if we look at the email at the bottom of that page, on the 11th of March, you are emailing Barnaby Carrick. And you say this: Barnaby, further to your recent help with horizontal and vertical fire breaks within our rain screen cladding, we wonder if you could assist with what would be the normal fire rating required. And then you explain about the building, domestic block, internal party walls will be 120 minutes. In your experience, what would the rating be for horizontal and vertical breaks? This would help us to propose, hopefully, the correct product for building control to approve.
Yeah.
You see that there? And then if we look at the top of that page, Sue Shepherd says, "Hi Kevin, thank you for sending across. Following our conversation, I've just spoken with Barnaby and he should be responding to you shortly." Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, you're asking for advice from Siderise on the rating of the barriers at this point.
Yeah.
Again, my question is, did you take any advice at this point from Siderise about where to put the vertical and horizontal barriers?
No, not at all.
That was because you were clear in your mind where they were going to go?
Yeah, they were as close to the positions shown in the architect's drawings, and they complied with the discussions with Harley.
Right. And shortly after that, on the 12th of March 2015, Mr. Mort, Siderise's technical officer, responds. If we could go to BSD 401779. So this is Mr. Mort to you. And he says, "Hi Kevin, we would confirm that to meet the requirements of approved document B, the area between compartment wall and outer cladding needs only to be a cavity barrier, 30 minutes integrity and 15 minutes insulation, which would mean that our open state cavity barrier system would be suitable. If you need me to comment on a specific detail, please forward over and I will respond immediately. Apologise for the delay." And he says, "Please see diagram 33 below." Can you see that? He's actually cut and pasted it into your email.
Could we just page up a little bit?
Go page up.
Yeah. I see, yeah.
Yes.
So he's made specific comment to that being rain screen.
Yes, and about whether or not their product would be suitable.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, you're having diagram 33 brought to your attention. Do you recall noticing that diagram 33 marks cavity barriers around the windows?
Yes, yes.
But you were still comfortable, were you, despite that, with the arrangement that you were showing on your drawings?
We were still discussing it at this stage, yes.
When you say still discussing it at this stage,
Well, you'll see this email trail goes on quite a while and is picked up by Ben.
I appreciate you're still discussing the rating of the cavity barriers, but is it your evidence that you were still discussing the location, where to put the cavity barriers?
The whole subject of cavity barriers, yes.
Right. So even though we saw you'd issued those drawings on the 3rd of March showing cavity barriers,
Yeah.
you felt in your mind, did you, that the issue was still up for grabs as to how you ended up on that issue?
I felt we needed someone to say, this is all okay.
I see. Now, it appears that Mr. Hoban had concerns at this point regarding the fire integrity of the cavity barriers. If we go RBK 3048734, on the 20th of March, so this is an email from John Hoban, and it's to Neil Crawford and Paul Hanson at Neil Crawford of Studio E, Paul Hanson at RBKC Building Control, and you're copied in. And John Hoban is referring to the building regulations, and he says to Neil Crawford, further to my conversation with you today, I would confirm that the fire time for new elements of structure in Grenfell Tower is 120 minutes as specified in, and he's talking about table A2
Yes.
of approved document B, which I just referred to
Yeah.
just a moment ago. I would also draw your attention to diagram 33 of approved document B and highlight the detail between compartment floors and external cladding. In the meantime, should you wish to discuss any other aspects of the project, Neil, then please do not hesitate to call me. So at this point, John Hoban is saying his view is it needs to be 120 minutes.
No. He's saying the new elements of the structure. We were just talking about the existing elements of the structure. Where the boxing club was, there was new elements of the structure being constructed, and that was a different zone as far as fire rating was concerned.
Isn't it right that what Mr. Hoban's referring to as new elements of structure is the new cladding, the overcladding on the whole building, new columns, beams, sections of compartment floor?
Not at all. You can have a look at the architect's fire strategy plans, which clearly shows the lower levels of having a greater fire rating.
So
Harley provided some new walls where there were no concrete walls. They provided an SFS construction in these areas. This was the new structure.
I see. So your evidence is that this wasn't concerned with levels 4 to 23 of Grenfell Tower?
I don't believe so.
This was
no.
concerned with the lower levels?
Yes, definitely.
Mr. Chairman, I wonder whether that's an appropriate moment. Again, I'm midway
Yes.
through this topic, but it goes on, and that's as good a moment as any.
If that suits you, that's, I think,
Yeah.
will suit the rest of us as well. Good, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Lamb, we're going to have a break now for some lunch, so please remember not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, and we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you. 2 o'clock, please. Okay.